Welcome back to English 301. Now we will talk about verbs. Please open to page 13 in your book. The slide you're looking at now is a summary of the information on page 13. There is an awful lot to say about verbs. We'll begin with verb components. These are the components that I would like you to identify in every verb you find in the homework. In the previous homework, you needed only to identify that a word was a verb. Now we need to say more about it. There are 4 components, or 4 parts of verbs, that we need to understand. I'm going to take about a half an hour to walk through a description of these parts. In the next video, we will move on to see some examples. First, we need to talk about tense. I am sure that you all know what the tense of a verb is, or what that word means. If you look to the definition on page 13, we see that tense is defined as the time or the when of a verb. Next, you see that I have written that there are 3 grammatical tenses in English. It might seem obvious that there are 3 tenses. That is to say, that there is a past, a present, and a future. This is true. We're human beings, and we live, so to speak, in past, presents, and futures. Grammatically, however, there could be fewer or more tenses expressed. In English, we have 3 grammatical ways to describe or indicate the past, present, and future of a human action. In Japanese, in contrast, there are only 2 grammatical ways to describe a tense. I'm oversimplifying a bit here, but for the purposes of the example, let me simply say that Japanese grammatically expresses a past and a present. The language does not have a grammatical way to express the future. What I mean will become clear shortly. But for now, let me say that to say that the Japanese language does not have a way to express the future clearly and obviously does not mean that the Japanese people can never discuss the future. That would be ridiculous. So they have another way of expressing the future that has to do with combining words in a certain way. That is not, in fact, a grammatical construction. So, for example, in English, we use the word will with a verb to express the future. That's a grammatical construction. Japanese has no such way to do that. So when I say that, looking back at page 13, there are 3 grammatical tenses in English, it's important to note that different languages express grammatically different numbers of tenses, or can express different numbers of tenses. So let's begin to discuss the way that English describes or indicates these 3 tenses that it does, in fact, indicate grammatically. So we have a past action, which is a prior action, obviously, something that happened in the past. As you know, we usually express this form with an ed added to a word. So if I were to say I smile in the present, I would say I smiled in the past. There's more to say about that, but there's the basic example. The present is a current action. I smile. The future is a future action. I will smile. We add the word will to indicate grammatically the future. Seems obvious enough. We'll get into some examples shortly. The next component of the verb that I would like you to identify is the aspect. This, I think, is the trickiest component, and it will take some getting used to. In the abstract, or generally speaking, these aspects might be difficult to comprehend or to conceptualize, to get into your mind. They will make sense in practice. I will take a moment, however, to discuss these general definitions. Again, looking to page 13, an aspect is, and this is quite clunky but accurate, the duration of time that the verb covers, the degree of the verb's completion. It's those two things or some combination of those two things. And again, in the abstract, or generally speaking, that doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. Let me continue to discuss things generally again, and we'll get to some examples. The simple aspect is probably the aspect that occurs most frequently. This is defined as, on page 13, an action that generally occurs, or that is completed, or will be complete at a specific time. So, for example, I smiled. That would be the simple aspect. Smiled, simple aspect, an action that is complete. It's simple in that way. It also happens to be in the past tense. So for I smiled, we would say tense, past, aspect, simple. If I were to say, however, I smile, simply put, that is also the simple aspect. And what tense is it? It's present tense. I smile. Now, this could be a description of an action that is complete, a simple action that is complete. I smile. But think about that statement as a simple sentence. If I were to say to you, I smile, you probably wouldn't think I actually meant that in this moment I just smiled for you. You probably wouldn't think of that statement as expressing a simple action that actually occurred. You would probably think of it as, looking back to simple, the first part of the simple definition, you would probably think of that as me telling you something, or my telling you something about an action that generally occurs. Again, look to the first part of the definition of the simple aspect, an action that generally occurs. So if I were to say to you, I smile a lot, if I add those two words, a lot, and those are two words, they're not one word, that expresses more clearly the sense of what I smile is doing in that sentence. I smile is telling you about an action that generally occurs. That statement is not telling you, in that case, that at this particular moment, I just committed a smile, so to speak. So simple, the simple aspect, can tell you about something, some action that generally tends to occur. Simple statements like that tend to tell you something about a person or a thing, tend to tell you things about those persons or things that are definitive. So if I were to say, I run, I'm generally telling you that I run a lot, that I am a runner. I'm probably not telling you that I am in the process or that right now I have just completed an act of running. So again, the simple can express an action that generally occurs, or it can express that an action has been completed, it's done with, or it will be complete at a specific time. Let's go to the next aspect, the progressive aspect. The progressive is a continuous action. I like to think of this as sort of a hamster running in place on a wheel, round and round and round, continuous. If I look at that hamster while he or she is running around that wheel, I would say, she is running. She is running tells me a number of things about that verb. That is to say, she is running tells us that in the present tense is, this hamster is continuously running, is in the process of doing that action continuously right now. So the progressive, and again, the way I like to think of this, is continuous in the sense of a hamster constantly running around a wheel. If I were to say, however, or if I wanted to say that the hamster will be doing or performing that activity of running in the future, in other words, that hamster would be on that wheel continuously, not now, but at a later time, I would say the hamster will be running tonight at about 10 o'clock. So I would add the will be running to express the future, and then I would say will be running to express the progressive aspect, to express the fact that that hamster won't jump on that wheel, run for a second, and jump off. That hamster will jump on and continuously be in the process or be running. Right? So, continuous action. The good news is progressive aspect, the progressive aspect, is always indicated by an ing at the end of a verb. Remember, other words, such as gerunds, which are nouns, can end with ing. Don't confuse those with progressive verbs. This might be a little tricky at first, but you'll get used to it. So progressive, continuous action, ends with an ing. The perfect aspect is the trickiest. The perfect, as defined on page 13, is a completed action whose effects are felt at a later time. Seems to make no sense in the abstract. Let me try to explain. A completed action, a perfected action, is an action that begins at one point and ends in another. So it covers a duration of time. It covers a space of time rather than indicates just one point in time in the way that the simple aspect does. So think of a duration of time, right? A space of time, moving from one point to another point. That's what the perfect describes. Now, what that means in terms of making sense of a verb within a statement can vary. This is where things can get a little bit tricky, but also interesting. So let's use the word smile again. So if I were to say, again, simple aspect, present tense, I smile, tells you something about me as a person. I like to smile a lot, or something like that. If I were to say in the progressive aspect, smile, using the progressive aspect, I would say, I am smiling. I am, present tense, smiling, right? Continuous, I'm in the process right now. I'm smiling. Imagine me smiling over many minutes here. Ending with an ing, I am smiling, right? Imagine yourself writing an email to someone in response to a message that you like, saying, I'm smiling right now, right? Imagine me smiling. In the perfect, in the present tense, we would say, I have smiled. I have smiled. The perfect is always indicated by the words have, has, or had. So make a note of that. We'll see examples in a moment. Have, has, or had. That's the tense. That indicates the tense of the perfect, that word. Then you have the rest of the verb, the content of the verb. I have smiled. So let me fill in that sentence a little bit to give it a kind of sense. I have smiled often in my life. I have smiled often in my life. That have smiled, that verb in the present perfect, expresses a duration of time. It tells you that at some point in the past, I began smiling, right? I have smiled, right? In the past, I smile, and in the present, I still smile. I have smiled, right? So it's the expression of an activity I've performed in the past that I'm still performing in the present, or whose effects I'm still feeling in the present. So another example, if I were to say something like, I have run all my life, right? That indicates that in the past, at some point, I ran or began to run, began to become a runner, and now I still run. Or now I'm continually feeling the effects of having run. So it covers a duration. Now, if I were to say, if I wanted to express the perfect in the past tense, so the examples I just described were the present perfect. If I had wanted to describe a different duration of time, the past perfect, a duration of time that is over with, I could say something like, I had run. Had indicates, when used as part of a verb, the past perfect. So again, have or has indicates present perfect. Had indicates past perfect. So if I were to say, I had run, I'm trying to think of a way to finish that sentence, but let's keep it like that for now. I had run. What I'm telling you is that at some point in the past, I began to run. Then, at some point in the past, I stopped running. The duration of time begins at one point in the past and ends at another point in the past. It doesn't carry into the present tense for me. It doesn't carry into now. So you can think of this as covering a duration of time, but covering a duration of time that is over with. It's really done. It's completely in the past. So another example, if I were to say, I had loved him when I was a teenager. I had, indicating past and perfect past, loved. I had loved him. That statement communicates that at some point in the past, let's say when I was 13, until some other point in the past, let's say until I was 17, I had loved a particular person. So the range or the duration of time that is covered is between my 13th and my 17th years. But it's done now. I had loved. Let's put that example in the present perfect. I have loved him for many years. If we're back into the present perfect, then we're covering a different duration of time again. We're covering a period of time or a duration that began in the past and that is still continuing now, right? It goes from the past into the present moment. The past perfect, however, as I've said, covers a past duration of time, a duration that is over with now. I won't discuss the future perfect right now, but the idea is the same. And we'll see some examples. This will make more sense when we look to the examples. But rethink or listen again to these audios as you work through the homework. Third component of the verb, the mood. Looking again to page 13, the mood is defined as the attitude of the verb. There are 3 moods in English. And again, it is important to note that there are 3 moods that are expressed grammatically in English, just as it is important to express or to explain that there are 3 tenses in English. Some languages have a great number of ways to express moods in different grammatical forms. Ancient Greek, for example, has, I believe, I should know this, I've studied it for years and I can't remember the exact number, has 5 or 6 moods. Classical Arabic, if I'm recalling correctly, has 11 or 12 moods, grammatical ways of expressing mood. English has 3. We're fortunate in this sense that we have only 3 moods that are expressed grammatically, that have a grammatical expression. It simplifies things a bit. The first of these moods is the indicative. This is the mood that we see expressed most commonly. Indicative expresses certainty. It expresses that an action certainly has occurred. So if I were to say, I run, or let's make that rather than a description of a general condition, let's make it a simple condition in the past. So if I were to say, I ran yesterday, I'm telling you simply that past tense, simple aspect, I ran. When did I run? Yesterday. This is the indicative mood, which doesn't actually mark itself in any way. That is to say, there's nothing that tells us grammatically in that case. There's no extra word. There's no mark. There's no extra word. There's nothing that tells us that that is in fact the indicative mood, that that is in fact an expression of certainty. This is partly because the indicative mood is so common, it is the most frequently expressed mood, that it needs, or perhaps the language in some way thinks that it doesn't need a special marker. So when in doubt, when you're not sure, take a guess and say that the mood is indicative, and 80% of the time you're probably right. So I ran yesterday. That's a certainty. That is an expression of a fact. It's a statement of fact. It's not a possibility. It's not a condition of possibility. It's just a fact. I ran yesterday. It happened. It's certain. The imperative voice expresses necessity. The imperative is simply a command. Imperative means command. It means an order. You'll hear these naturally. We don't often use them, but they're very easy to spot. So if I were to want to put the word to run or the verb to run into the imperative form, I would simply say run, right? It's an order. We express commands very simply. So if I am looking at you and I want you to run, I want to issue that imperative, put the verb in the imperative form, imperative mood, I would say run. What is implied there is you run. You're the subject of that expression, and I'm telling you to run. We often don't express that you when we state a command, when we use the imperative mood. Often we leave it assumed or implied, but it's always there. I think in English we tend to use the you when we're especially angry or want to be emphatic about our command. So for example, if I lose my daughter in the store, let's say she's 4 years old, and this actually happened at one point, and after 20 minutes of panic, I find her again, and I say, "You get over here right now." I'm adding that "you" to mark or emphasize the command. And it expresses, in that case, my panic and my relief as well. So if I were to say, "Get over here right now," get is still a command, but the "you get" is always implied. So remember that. Imperatives are commands. Run, eat, talk, sleep, go, that always imply and can use the word "you," the subject "you," who is actually the subject of the command. Again, we don't often use imperatives, and they are easy to spot, and they express necessity precisely in that way, by commanding that something happen or must happen. The subjunctive mood expresses possibility, conditionality, desirability. The subjunctive mood does not express a certainty. Keep that in mind. What I will say right now is be careful not to confuse expressions of the subjunctive mood with larger expressions of meanings of doubt, or that is to say, with expressions of doubt more generally, or expressions of hopes or desires more generally. Don't, that is, confuse grammatical constructions with the larger meanings of sentences. You'll see what I mean when we get to the examples. For now, understand that the subjunctive, and I think this is the easiest way to remember it, is expressed grammatically as a shoulda, woulda, coulda. I call these shoulda, woulda, coulda verbs, right? Or moods, components of verbs. So, rather than say, "I ran yesterday," which is in the indicative mood and is an expression of certainty, I could say, "I should have run yesterday," right? If only I had. Oh, I wish that I had, right? So that's a subjunctive. It's an expression of possibility, conditionality, desirability, something I should have done. If I were to say today that I want to run, let's say that I haven't yet. Contrast this again with "I ran yesterday," which is a certainty. Let's say it's about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and I'm supposed to run at 7 o'clock in the evening. And I'm not quite sure that I want to, or I'm having trouble motivating myself. I could say something like, in the subjunctive, "I should run at 7. That's an expression of a possibility. It is not an expression of a certainty. To express that in the indicative mood, I would say, "I will run." That's an expression of certainty. That would be, "I will run," that is, future, simple, and indicative, certain. Future, simple, and indicative. To put that statement into the subjunctive mood, I would say, again, "I should run at 7. That is actually present, simple, subjunctive. I want to say something about that and use that particular example because it might seem odd to call that verb present tense. Here's what you need to remember, and you should really memorize this. Here we go. Ready? The subjunctive in English is always in the present tense. I don't know why, I don't know how. Sometimes I don't see how that makes sense, but it is simply the truth, so remember it. The subjunctive in English is always in the present tense. It seems to me sometimes that the subjunctive seems to be expressed in the future. Just remember that it's not. If it doesn't seem to make sense right now, never mind. Just memorize it. I do myself. It trips me up sometimes. So, again, if I were to say, I should run at 7, that would be the present tense, the simple aspect, and the subjunctive mood. We'll see lots of subjunctives, but remember that the indicative is the most commonly used mood in English. Voice. There are 2 voices in English. Again, in other languages, there are additional voices. For example, in ancient Greek, there is a middle voice that is expressed grammatically. I won't explain what that voice looks like, but just know that there are additional voices that can occur in other languages. English has 2 voices, the active and the passive. Voice, on page 13, is defined as what expresses how the subject relates to the action of the verb. How the subject relates to the action of the verb. In the active, the subject performs the action of the verb. In the passive, the subject receives the action of the verb. This makes perfect sense. Active, subject acts. Passive, subject receives. So, for example, if I were to say, I took the bus to school, the subject of that sentence is I. I am the one who's behaving or doing something in that sentence. What action am I performing? I took. I took the bus. I took it. It's active, right? Let's go through and identify the 4 components of the verb took in that sentence. I took. Past tense, simple action, right? Past tense, it already happened. Simple action, it's a simple completion of an act, right? That's the aspect. The mood is indicative, it's a certainty. And the voice is active. I took. I took the bus to school. Now let's put that same statement into a sentence that uses the passive voice. Here is the sentence. I was taken by the bus to school. It's a terrible sentence, and it's a good example. I use a bad sentence partly because the passive voice is very much overused. It's used sloppily and not deliberately. When used well, the passive voice is very effective for doing a number of things that we'll talk about later. But be careful. When you can, use the active voice. It's much more clear. So, to that sentence, I was taken by the bus to school. The subject there, again, is I. I am the person in that sentence who's acting in some way or being acted upon. Was taken is our verb. That's a form of to take. Let's identify its parts. So what tense was taken? Think about it for a minute. Past. Was. We look to the first word. I was. It's not I am taken, but I was taken. We look to the first word to identify the tense. I was taken. Past tense. Aspect. This is still the simple aspect. It's not progressive or continuous. There's no ing. It's not perfect because there's no have, had, or has, which indicates the perfect aspect. It is simply an action that happened once in the past. It's completed. I was taken by the bus to school. It happened. It's a done and did. So again, tense, past, aspect, simple. The mood of that verb is indicative. It is a certainty. It's not an order. It's not a possibility. It's indicative. So we have past, simple, indicative, and the voice is passive. In this case, I didn't take the bus. I took the bus. There's no action there. I am passively receiving the action of the verb. If you look again at the definition, I was taken. So imagine that I sort of laying down and being carried by that bus. That's what the passive indicates. So I didn't took. I was taken. I'm passive. I was taken by the bus to school. And again, that's a horrible sentence. Who would say that? Think about that. I was taken by the bus to school. It's sloppy, it's clunky, the passive is not necessary. Again, passives can be used very, very effectively for different reasons, and we'll talk about those ways that the passive can be used. But as a rule of thumb, use the active voice whenever you're able to. All right, just to review a bit. In this week's homework, and in all the homework assignments hereout, when you identify a verb in a sentence, I want you to identify these 4 components as well. So for example, with the word let's say I ran. Let's go back to that simple example. I want you to tell me first which verb it is that you're dealing with. So I ran is the verb to run. So tell me that first. In other words, give me the infinitive form of the verb first. We'll work through some examples in a moment, but I want to give you these directions first. So I ran. You'd say ran is a verb. Then you say which verb it is that you're dealing with. To run. This is important because when verbs have more than one word, sometimes we can become confused about which verb it is that we're actually dealing with. This is a simple example where it may seem unnecessary to explain that we're using the verb to run, but I want you to get into this habit. So, I ran. To run is what you put first, that is the verb that we're dealing with. Then I want you to identify the 4 the 4 components in the order that I have them here, and in the order that I've been just describing them. So first, tense, past. Next, aspect, simple. Next, mood, indicative. Next, voice, active. So the complete answer would be run, verb, to run, past, simple, indicative, active. And I'm completely happy with your abbreviating. You can abbreviate these names. Just be clear with your abbreviations. That's the full description of the components of the verbs. Now please turn to page 16, on which you will find examples of verbs. And please now go to the second part of this video, in which I will work through some of these examples.